Bosses, what is the worst interview you've seen? Had a guy who interviewed for a position. Seemed to do okay in the actual interview, but when he was not selected for the position, he sent us an invoice for a few $1,000s. He charged us his normal hourly rate for his time and billed us for 50 hours. How was this situation handled after the bill? People are laughing at him on the internet as we speak. One time, an applicant told me that he was temporarily placed in charge of a team, and one of the team members spoke mostly French, so he told him to learn English or get out of here, and then subsequently sent him home when he did not immediately learn English. The question was, tell me about a time that you worked well under loose supervision. Sounds like the average boss to me. So this guy went through 5 30 to 60-minute interviews. I thought he was great and was ready to hire him. Just as a formality, I asked my boss to interview him. After 15 minutes, she walked out and tells us to send him home. This is what he asked her. I'm not sexist, but I know a lot of other people think women aren't great engineers. So my question is, how is it that you got into such a high-level position? Was it luck? Why? Why would you ever ask that? My old boss told me that one of the applicants put Jesus Christ as a reference. He asked him how would we contact your reference, since the applicant didn't put any contact info for Jesus, and my old boss was curious about how he will answer. Apparently, the applicant told him, like this, and then he started praying. I forgot to ask him if he got the job or not, since I couldn't stop laughing. Why didn't I get the job? We talked to your contact, and he said don't do it, bro. We tried to contact your reference multiple times with no answer. A woman was about 15 years older than I was and clearly didn't understand that I was the one interviewing her for the job. This was an engineering position on my team making $175K. She was very candid with me regarding her overall personality and actually put her purse on her lap at one point and did her makeup while we were talking. I guess she thought I was the secretary and she was making small talk before meeting with my boss. How did the interview go, and how did she react when she realized you were the one interviewing her? I don't think she ever really realized. She met with a colleague after meeting with me, and I assume she gave him the real interview face. We laughed at her afterwards and shredded her resume. Interviewer: so, what qualities can you bring to the team? Applicant: I don't know. Interviewer: well, what do you consider yourself good at? Applicant: I don't know. Interviewer: okay. Why did you apply for the position? Applicant: they told me to. Interviewer: who told you to apply? Applicant: I don't know. Back when I was an HR manager for a market research firm, one of the most awkward interviews was with my candidate and his mother. This 19-year-old, who apparently had previous work experience in customer service, brought his mother into the interview with him. I politely questioned his mother as to the reasoning for her joining in on the interview, and I was told, I'm just making sure this is the right company for him and making sure you're asking fair questions. I decided to roll with it. Why not? This is the most interesting thing I've had all week. So I asked my first question and she answered for him. I politely explained that the interviews I conduct are with the candidate only, unless special accommodations are required. I was told, I'm not going anywhere. I thanked them both for coming out and explained that the position requires problem solving and critical thinking on an individual level. Unless I'm hiring both of them under one salary and working together as a full-time equivalent, this wouldn't work. I was then told I would be sued and to screw myself. Poor kid. He was probably like, Mom, I got this. I know what I'm doing. And she was like, oh, my poor baby, who did this to you? We had an applicant for a teaching position who stated on his resume that he held a Master of Music degree from Yale. When interviewing him, I asked what he thought of Woolsey Hall, Yale's primary concert hall, and its renowned pipe organ. By his answer and facial expression, I could tell he'd never been there. After he left, I called contacts at the university who confirmed that they'd never heard of him and no one by his name had received a degree there. I'll bet he doesn't really have a doctorate of Kung Fu either. I once interviewed a guy for a work-study position at a college radio station. The position was for 10 hours a week as a sports reporter. I told him that he would sometimes have to carry the equipment for the remote broadcast of sports, and he immediately took his shoe and sock off and put his foot on the table to show me a scar on his foot. Tells me that he has a plate in his foot and sometimes it hurts, and he wouldn't be able to carry heavy things when it was hurting. Why couldn't he just have said it? No visual aid is needed. I have no idea. What was crazy is that the interview was going really well up until that point. I mean, dressed in a suit, very polite, and seemed knowledgeable. Then puts his nasty foot on the table. I've got tons of these. This one is my current favorite. I had a guy come in for a CDL and site work, truck driving and earth moving equipment position. After the initial pleasantries, he went on to inform me that he didn't like small talk. His pet peeve is people who socialize too much on the job when there is work to be done. He likes to get right to it and get hammering away on that work. He just doesn't understand these people who just talk and talk instead of getting on with it. Not like him. He is not interested in chatting. No, he's got a better work ethic than these damn kids, and he's not going to stand around gabbing about anything when time is wasting, etc., etc., etc. He went on like that with no exaggeration for an hour and 20 minutes. A solid hour and a half, including the initial question and answer bit at the beginning. I wasn't even mad. I just let him ramble on. At the end of it, he asked if he would be starting that day or if I needed to do some of this paperwork stuff for him. He hadn't even filled out his pre-hire information forms. Absolutely majestic. Of course he didn't fill those out. The man had work to do. No time to be filling out any silly forms, gotta focus on getting things done. Yeah, and doing stuff is a lot more productive than paper and typing things up. And he's a guy who does things, not a guy who types and writes down things that have to be done. Just skips the extra step and just does it. My dad made someone lose it in an interview. The interview happened in a cubicle near his, and the way the applicant sat, he had direct line of sight to my dad while his coworker had her back to him. He sneezed and his dentures flew out of his mouth right into his garbage can. The guy lost it. He was screaming with laughter. The coworker was really mad that the candidate wasn't taking the interview seriously, especially since all he was laughing at was my dad fishing out something out of the basket. That's hilarious. Did the coworker eventually find out your dad had sneezed his dentures into the garbage can? I couldn't fault anyone for laughing at that. Yeah, she learned about it afterwards. The candidate couldn't stop laughing long enough to explain. I was sitting in on an interview and this kid comes in with an open Hawaiian shirt and khakis. This was for a state job, mind you. When asked if he had any questions for us, he goes, "Yeah, do you drug test?" And when walking him out of the building, he looks at the pictures of all the heads of that department and stops at the only woman there and goes, "When can I meet her? I want to know about her life." We immediately shredded his application. In 2010, I conducted an interview with an applicant for a warehouse job. During the course of the interview, I mentioned my slight frustration about the grounded flights in Europe due to the volcano eruption in Iceland. Grounded flights meant we weren't receiving stock and work was slow as a result. The applicant chimed in with, and I'm paraphrasing, "It's just another one of those things. He knows. He's mad." Who's mad? God. He's mad. Just like that big tsunami a few years ago. God's mad and he's letting us know. We need to be more careful. More careful about what, do you think? This whole gay acceptance thing. God's mad and he's letting us know. We need to abide by the good book or this kind of thing is just going to keep happening. Then he failed the drug test. Were you interviewing Mac from It's Always Sunny? I was working as a front-end supervisor for a big box retailer going into the holiday season. This was the beginning of November. I get this girl who came in for an interview and I let her know it was seasonal work, but that we would be keeping some of the seasonal hires after January and inquired as to whether she was looking for seasonal or long-term. In the most stereotypical Valley Girl voice I've ever heard, she replied, "Well, I basically got in trouble for bad grades and staying out too late, and my parents are making me pay for my own car insurance this month." That was it. She just stared at me, expecting me to hire her on the spot. I did not do that. I do still wonder if she ever got a job that helped her pay her car insurance for that month, though. Well, at least she got that far. Some rich kids probably don't know what a job interview is. Reminds me of my favorite Futurama quote. Amy, "It's okay, Mom, you and Dad can just stay with me." Mrs. Wong, "Who do you think has been paying your rent?" Amy, "What's the rent?" I sat in for RA interviews at my college. We had an Eagle Scout come in and take us page by page through a scrapbook about his scout career. Page by page. It was 10 or 20 pages of him explaining each and every one, taking a minute or two each time. We interrupted him to continue the interview, to which he got a little angry and said he was almost finished. He was able to add a page after the interview on how being an Eagle Scout doesn't guarantee you an RA job. I once had an interview at Home Hardware when I was younger. The boss asked me that stupid, "Where do you see yourself in 10 years?" question, and my dumbass answered, "Not working at Home Hardware when I'm 30. It wasn't a jab at him. I kinda rambled about having goals and that flew out in the end. So the 35-year-old didn't hire me after I insulted him to his face. Go figure. Now I try to be more present in the moment and less of an idiot. My dad was interviewing at a bunch of law firms. During an interview with a smaller firm, he was asked, "What makes you prefer to work here instead of a larger firm like Kravith, the firm he ended up at?" He responded truthfully, "I wouldn't prefer to work here. Very sweet man, very smart, very accomplished, but pathologically incapable of lying during interviews." It's a curious phenomenon that we're at a point where we're rewarded for lying. We know we're lying, they know we're lying, yet the best lie wins. I sat in on interviews with a manager at the restaurant I worked at. I remember this application he pulled specifically because the kid was from the same rough part of town the manager was. The manager comes in on a 5-minute rant on how much he hates scam artists trying to get money off of decent people in the streets. Upon hearing this, the kid launched into a story about telling people he locked his keys in the car with his wallet and just needed $20 to pop a lock. Explains he could make $300 on a good day. The kicker? He doesn't even have a car. He laughs while all of us stare at him dumbfounded. The manager kicked him out and he got a job down the street. That moment when the scam artist and the manager realize they've met once before. 10 minutes later, the manager notices his wallet is missing. Again. Had a girl sit across from me, put her elbow on my desk, then rested her head flat on her hand so that her head was now sideways. She stayed that way through the entire interview. Another time, I asked a guy if he had any special skills. He replied, "Keeping it real with y'all." Maybe she liked to interview in landscape mode. I'm not a boss, but my boss was actually just telling me about a woman she interviewed for my job about 6 months ago before I was hired. She came in for the interview in cut-off jean shorts and a nice top that was more appropriate for the club scene. Anyway, my boss decided early on in the interview that this woman wouldn't be hired. After all the initial cliche questions, the woman would answer, I'm not sure. They say their goodbyes. We'll let you know," kind of crap, even though they didn't hire her. The following Monday, though, she came in for work. They had to tell her she didn't have the job, and they were still going over all the other applicants. She left, but came back Tuesday and then Wednesday, and every day she came in for a week or two, thinking she had the job. My boss finally had to tell her if she came back, they would call the police on her. She finally got the hint, but damn, she really wanted to work, I guess. This sounds like a story an old person would tell about how they actually got a job from doing this. This is not far off of how my elders tried to help me get a job. Just go in every day, twice a day. Make sure to call immediately after the interview like 2 times. Shake the manager's hand. If the manager is not there, wait around until they show up. Make them repeat your name 5 times to make sure they know it. Leave a framed picture of you in a suit on the counter so they don't forget you and know what a hard worker you are. The worst one I had was a guy that showed up and refused to answer any questions. I don't know. That doesn't apply to me. So after 6 questions, I asked, "Do you expect to get hired after this?" He said yes. I have to know, what did he think didn't apply to him? I'm going to paraphrase here, but something to the tune of, "Tell me about a time you didn't get along with a coworker and how did you handle it?" Nothing special. I work at a real estate company that designs all of our marketing material in-house. As a result, when we were looking for a new assistant, having Illustrator/Photoshop experience was a huge plus. We typically do phone interviews before we ask people in. One of the questions is whether they know their way around. This guy answered yes, and I asked him for a more formal interview. But he comes in, well-dressed, nicely mannered, on time. We go through the motions. When I ask him about what kind of experience he has with Photoshop, he flat out tells me, "Oh, my girlfriend is really the one that does that. I'm not too familiar with that program." He didn't get the job. I had a guy come into an interview for a junior developer role. We were advertising at local universities for current students and recent leavers and had set our expectations to match. During the interview, I gave him access to a laptop with code examples, one of which would simply have required changing the text in the pop-up box to do exactly what we asked, and asked him to write a very basic script, basically a "Hello World" pop-up box, just to show that he actually knew what he was doing. After 10 minutes of confusion, he asked if he could go home, Google the question, and then email me his code. True to his word, he went home, Googled the question exactly, and pasted the answer from the top result, errors and all. He didn't get the job. Every other applicant was able to do the test on the spot in less than 5 minutes, as would anyone who had used the language for any more than 5 minutes. Second was a guy who applied for an L2 tech support position. The first issue was he showed up 45 minutes early and was extremely impatient. Yes, you can show up too early for an interview. So he started off on the wrong foot, then told me the reason he was early/impatient was that his daughter had driven him because he had no car or license. Public transport in our area sucks, so unless you live in one of the surrounding suburbs, you really need a car, taking over an hour on public transport where it would be 20 minutes by car. He's then telling me about his couple of decades of IT experience as a sysadmin, project manager, IT manager, etc., all of which he significantly downplayed in his resume. This, of course, then made me ask him if he had seen the clearly defined salary I had put on the job ad, which resulted in a "yes, I saw that," and would expect a significant promotion and double the salary after 6 months. He somehow seemed stunned that the interview concluded after that. Bonus best/worst job application I've seen was a person who responded to one of my ads with a simple email stating, "I'll take it," and only listing his name, address, phone number, and no resume, etc. The best thing of all was the job ad was posted on an Australian job site for a job in Australia, yet the bloke was from the US. Had he been local, I almost would have interviewed him for craps and giggles. "Aw man, you missed a great opportunity." You could have replied, "Okay, I'll see you tomorrow morning at our office in person for an interview," and then given him the Australian address, and wait to see what happened. I'm in Canada, applied for a job once around here, and got an email with an interview scheduled at their corporate office in Australia. Declined that interview. I had a guy show up who was a redhead and short. He had a beard. He wore a green suit. It was difficult to interview him with a straight face. He didn't get the job. I can imagine he has bought a cheap green suit for St. Patrick's Day and assumed, well, that will do for my interview. Due to some budget cuts, we were forced to replace all of our locally based contractors with contractors in India, software dev. We fought like hell but lost that battle. At least we won the battle to have a phone interview with all of the Indian replacements. Management would have been okay with letting the consulting firm dump whoever on us. During several of the interviews, we would ask a question. Then there'd be a long pause, or even the sounds of typing, if they were too stupid to mute their phone. Then they'd read off an answer that was almost too perfect. They were Googling the questions. I think we managed to find a couple of guys who weren't terrible, but I don't know if all the vacant positions were ever filled. I started blasting out my resume and got hired elsewhere a month later. I wasn't going down with that sinking ship. In the early 2000s, we had an open position for a web developer. I phone interviewed an Indian guy who was spectacular. He was rattling off answers that were way too above his pay grade of this entry-level position. Do an in-person interview with him again, spectacular. Hire the guy? Only the guy that shows up on the first day isn't the same guy I interviewed and barely speak enough English to tell me who he is. That turned into an ugly legal battle that we ultimately won, but it costs the company a lot of money to fight. I think they were just looking to get a payday out of us. I've heard of having a different person than the candidate do the phone interview. In fact, my employer now requires Skype video chat for all remote interviews. But how the hell did they think they would get away with sending someone other than the candidate for an in-person interview? I had to interview a guy for some contract labor. I showed him our work vehicle, he shook my hand and said, "I'm sorry, but I refuse to drive a Chevy," and left. I was speechless. He was giving me the story of how hard he was having it. I decided to give him a shot, and because we had a Silverado for the work vehicle, he turned it down. He has 3 young children. Funny how guys who have all the bad luck are always making stupid decisions. It's like the people who are always complaining about not having money are always the first ones to leave and turn down the opportunity for overtime. They are usually the ones who go out to eat every day as well. "Why did you want to become a teacher?" The guy cries and spends 10 minutes telling us about how he was bullied at school. I work in a school, not as a teacher, but in IT. Teachers really need to have thick skin because those kids can be brutal. I was hiring for an entry-level position. The woman showed up with a gold nose ring in, professional setting mind you, and a moon nightgown on. She then proceeds to tell me she doesn't have a driver's license while she scratched her breast. She didn't want the job. She wanted to keep her unemployment/benefits, and you have to apply to a certain number of jobs per month or week? Bingo. Unemployment checks on how many jobs you apply to, not what you're like at the interview. And many of those who have no intention of working will deliberately give a bad interview. I was interviewing someone that had come to the US from the country I was born in. Throughout the interview, she kept telling me how much better our country was, and how much smarter and more educated she was than Americans. I politely thanked her for her time, told her that we were looking for a different skill set and attitude, and suggested she might consider going back to the motherland, as it seemed she would be much happier there. She told me that it was obvious that I had become a dumb American and that I should go screw myself. It was funny. Funny how she was trying to live and work in the US if it was so terrible there, rather than le glorious motherland. I have a Mexican lady that works for me, and you know what she told me the other day? that we all needed to learn to speak Spanish to accommodate her better. I mean, really, we are 20 miles from the Canadian border. At my old retail job, I went into the storeroom to grab something as another coworker was clocking in. We overheard and then got dragged into an interview my then manager was doing. The guy, for some unknown reason, went off on a PETA rant and lecture on the evils of hunting and how awful hunters are, to my manager and coworker who just received their deer permits, which he had no knowledge of. He just decided to rant and semi-scream at us and drag us into the interview. It turned into almost a half-hour rant. After the guy left, I asked our manager what that was about. The manager replied, I asked him to tell me a little about himself. Yeah, the guy did not get the job. I was asking the asinine HR-mandated questions for a senior IT role and got to, have you ever been criticized for anything? The normal response is, no, or my boss says I work too hard. This normal up until now guy thought for a bit and said, I get angry when people try to pull the wool over my eyes, and sat glaring at the table. After a bit, I asked if he was okay. He looked up and began a 20-minute rant about the people who'd tried to pull the wool over his eyes. He was devastated when I called him the next day. He thought he'd done pretty well and demanded a written statement of why he hadn't been offered the job. Did you guys send him that statement? If so, were you honest? Or did you pull the wool over his eyes? I was having a total crap day until I read this comment. I mean, it's a great comment and all, but not one which most people would spend like 2 minutes straight laughing so hard you can't breathe, which I totally just did. My wife and kids were like, what's so funny? Which made me laugh even harder. Anyway, appreciate the comic relief from an otherwise horrendous day. I was working as a temp for a business on the day they were holding interviews for new staff. The business took up one floor of a large office building. Clients and potential employees would press a buzzer outside the building, which connected to the relevant floor/business, and the receptionist would speak to them and then press a button to open the door, and they could come into the building and get an elevator to our floor. On this day, I was the receptionist responsible for buzzing people in. All goes well throughout the morning. Then around lunchtime, 2 guys buzz asking to come up for their interviews. I check their names off and press the buzzer to open the door. 5 minutes go by and they still haven't appeared from the elevator. They press the buzzer again. I buzz them in again. No guys show up. For half an hour, they are asking to be buzzed in and I'm pressing the button and they are failing to open the door. I'm starting to think maybe it's me. But another guy presses the buzzer asking to come up for his interview. I buzz him in, and a couple of minutes later, he's getting out of the elevator. Finally, after almost an hour, well after their interview slots have passed, someone who worked on another floor was coming into the building and saw the guys standing outside. He buzzed me to ask what was going on, and I asked him to let them in. He says he will, and I wait, really curious now to meet these 2 guys who can't open a door. 10 minutes go by, then another 10 and still nothing. Finally, almost an hour after the guy let them in, and 2 hours after their interview times, some lady from another floor comes in leading 2 guys. She says, these 2 have been sitting in our reception for an hour. Thought I'd better bring them down. They didn't get jobs. Amazing that 2 guys, one just as stupid as the other one, managed to be so clueless after that much time together. It never once occurred to either of them to ask someone where to go. Thanks for watching until the end. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you know when our next video is available. For more videos just like this one, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.